So welcome everybody. Very pleased that you've managed to attend our Maximise Your Lean ROI webinar this time. This is Claire Cordeau here. I'm just introducing the webinar, and I'm delighted that Brittany is able to present it and draw on her great experience in using both lean and simulation together. What I'm also delighted about is that for many of you who attend these on a regular basis, you'll know that we usually run them from two sides of the Atlantic, and unusually we're all sitting in the same room. So the people that normally run these webinars from Scotland, England and the US are all together. We're very pleased that you've been able to attend, and I'm just going to hand over before we get started to Hazel just to take you through some of the housekeeping.
Thank you, Claire. So within the webinar, all attendees are automatically set to mute. Therefore, if you do have any questions, and we do welcome questions, so please, if you have any questions or comments, please send them across to us. And you can send them via the question panel on the right-hand side. So on the housekeeping slide, you'll just see the second image. There's the small chat panel. So if you could just send us any questions that you may have through there. We will endeavour to answer all questions at the end of the session. However, should we run out of time, we will post these on the Simulating Health LinkedIn page. So if you do have anything, please send them our way.
Great. Well, we're just going to jump right in. This is Brittany here, and so I just want to give you a little bit of context about where we're going to go today, and then we'll jump right into the good stuff. So really quickly, I'm just going to touch on kind of the current state of lean and things that are happening in the industry, and kind of give us all a common understanding of where we're coming from, and then we're going to start to talk about enhanced lean practice. Now, this is based on my experience. These are places where I see opportunity to integrate simulation into lean in order to enhance ROI, and these are things that I've done in my practice. I really would welcome any of your feedback on the LinkedIn forum or in other ways. If you want to email or do a discussion after this, because this has been my experience, and I want to share that with you, but we also want to encourage discussion because obviously there are many other ideas that are really important to look at. And then I'm just going to touch really quickly on what I'm calling the practitioner's guide to simulation, which is really just some of the barriers, some of the questions that I tend to run into when I do this myself and when I work with other practitioners. And then last, I'm really excited to share some lessons from Loughborough. We actually had a really interesting discussion at Loughborough University last Friday, and we were able to bring together researchers, lean practitioners, simulation experts, and have a discussion about where there's opportunities to integrate the two together, and also where we see opportunity to do some additional research and learn some more on both sides. So we're going to touch on some of the big ideas that were discussed last Friday and share those with you. Great. So I just want to give you a little bit of quick perspective. This is where I started my simulation journey. I'm an engineer by background and was doing Lean Six Sigma within healthcare, particularly with healthcare providers. And this was one of my Lean projects that we came up to a point where we were really excited about our future state and the Lean processes that we had designed, but we really were nervous about going live, and we needed to do something about the stakeholder engagement and really give ourselves some confidence that it was actually going to work the way we're expecting. So just for quick background, radiology, they were dealing with patients who needed to be sedated, and they were waiting up to 7 weeks for this radiology test, which is obviously causing a lot of delays in the quality of the care and the timing of the diagnosis, poor satisfaction, lost revenue. This is a poor situation all around. And so really we wanted to redesign this process, and we had designed a new process through a Kaizen event where we brought all the nursing staff primarily together, as well as some of our anesthesiologists. And we designed this process, but we wanted to test out really how it was going to work, and if it was going to work the way we expected. So we had some key measures that we wanted to look at, particularly staff utilization, space utilization, and then that patient waiting time as being really important to whether this was a good idea or not. So we had a couple of different variables we were going to play with, and we built a really simple model. And what we were able to find is that it turned out that if we set it up with 6 beds, we were actually going to be able to manage this. This is a fairly small space, and so we only had space for these 6 beds, and we wanted to make sure that was going to work before we brought patients in. And we were actually working to double the volumes of patients going through this space. So pretty significant change from our current state. And you can see the total results on the end there on the right. We were able to reduce the time to appointment pretty significantly. And you can see just the bottom there, a very simple model. That was it. That was the whole thing. You can see patients moving through the process, going to their MRI, and then coming back for recovery. And just with this simple picture and the animation that went with it, the results that went with it, we were able to decide, that this was going to work and build the confidence that we could actually go ahead and implement this. So I give you that backstory because I think it really helps give you a context for where some of my my suggestions that we're going to talk through really shortly are going to come from. All right, so let's jump right into kind of the current scene. Across the globe, both in the U.S. in my experience as well as in the U.K., Australia, Canada, we're seeing this all over that really lean is becoming the healthcare standard in terms of how we improve our processes. We also see the Six Sigma in there as well, and all sorts of combinations of the two, but really it's becoming very, very widespread. And so the question is, how are we doing with these new tools? And I think overall we are doing very well, particularly at getting people engaged, getting the excitement going, launching new programs, doing our strategy, implementing projects. There are some challenges and some areas that could use additional attention, and particularly I want to call out 2 things here. One being the culture change that is required to really implement this exceptionally well, as well as the need for a higher return on investment. We're getting return and we're doing great work, but there's always opportunity for improving process improvement, like we talked about Friday at the workshop. We also face some unique challenges in healthcare when it comes to taking these lean tools, which originated in industry, and bringing them into the healthcare space. In particular, these 5, right, the sustainment of the change. How do we actually make sure that once we implement that we're maintaining the changes and we're not sliding back into our old habits? We have tons of priorities. I mean, everything in healthcare is so important, right? Because we're dealing with people's health and well-being and patients' lives. Everything is important, and so how do we balance all of that out and make sure that we're focusing on the most important things? And adoption is another interesting one. In my experience, particularly working with clinicians, often they have been working in the industry for a long time. They have a lot of experience, a lot of expertise to share, and at the same time we want to continue to grow, continue to improve. How do we engage them in a meaningful conversation and help them understand some of these complex processes that they are working in? Okay, so with that said, I think there's clearly an opportunity for enhancing our return on investment, or ROI, and so I'm going to jump right into how we might enhance our current lean practice. First and foremost, I just want to point out that I think there's a significant overlap between the lean philosophy and the simulation philosophy. Often, well, maybe not often, but I regularly encounter individuals who feel that their particular tool set is the one that is the best suited to answer the need for process improvement. And I think what we really need to do is look for where those tool sets overlap. We've seen it with Lean and Six Sigma and bringing those 2 tool sets together increasingly. I also think that there's great opportunity to do that with simulation as well, and that there's a really great overlap in what we're trying to do. First and foremost, we always want to test before we implement. We do it in Lean through our pilots. We do it in Six Sigma through our improve phase. And we do it in simulation through our scenario testing. We're all trying to do the same thing, and so if we can integrate that and make that more effective for everybody, that's a huge win. We certainly want to measure our process performance in any of these environments. We want to understand how variability matters to our process, because of course both Lean and Six Sigma, one of the key tenets is to standardize, create standard work, reduce the variability in our processes in order to improve our outcomes. And the same thing is what we see in simulation. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we want to consider everybody's ideas. This is the key tenet in the Lean philosophy, right, to bring in the people who are on the front line doing the hard work and consider all of their suggestions and test everything out. And that's exactly what simulation allows us to do, right, is bring everybody to the table, throw everything up on the wall, and then see what the results actually are from everyone's ideas and keep everybody included. So obviously I think there's a lot of benefits from doing this and bringing simulation into Lean. And these are a few. I think probably one of the most important is to, and really unique values of simulation in the Lean context, is the ability to test over extended periods of time, to test non-existent processes and unlikely events. These are things that we can't do with Lean on its own. We can pilot, we can test with example patients, we can walk through the process, but we can't run it for a long time and see what happens. We also can't test unlikely events. We can't test flu surges, we can't test disaster scenarios, we can't test the new schedule without actually implementing it. And by using simulation, we're able to do those things in a way that Lean and Six Sigma just aren't equipped. It's not an option for us in those, with just those tool sets. So how do we think about actually doing this? Right? Okay, so great, Brittany, this all sounds really wonderful, but practically speaking, what am I going to do tomorrow? And there's really three different ways that we can think about integration. Historically, I think we've seen a lot of independent simulations. This being the scenario where you decide you're going to work on your emergency room, you build a very complex model that represents that particular environment, but it's really an independent project from the rest of your Lean and Six Sigma initiatives. That's really been our traditionally historic model. The way we're moving into, and this is just like the example I just talked about with the radiology situation where I first started, is to build a very small model, very simple, during the Lean project to test one specific thing, right, for one specific purpose, which is great and adds a lot of value. And then really in our ideal future state, we would want to integrate simulation into the standard Lean process. Right, so it becomes part of the tool set, it becomes integrated with the things we're already doing, not an add-on. In case if you're very interested in this in particular, I'm going to ask Claire just to jump on real quick and tell us a little bit about some work that she was involved with Warwick University.
Thanks very much. Yes, this was the SimLean project, which was run by Professor Stuart Robinson and Professor Zoe Radner at the Warwick Business School. And what they did was they brought Lean and simulation together within some rapid improvement projects, so rapid improvement events with hospitals in the UK. And it's very interesting the way that they use simulation. They set up some models to look at typical healthcare processes to kind of pick up some very key lessons, which was part of an educate phase to help people think about the typical kind of things that would happen and what you could improve and how could you improve it. So they might have an example of an operating room, for example, but actually the lessons could be applied equally well to the emergency department. And then when they ran a rapid improvement event, they used the simulation to facilitate that event. So they would develop a simulation live of the question that people were looking at and test out different scenarios to help them understand it. Now the simulation wouldn't be completely correct in that moment, but was there to really drive the thinking and help people to discuss what the improvement scenarios might be and what the problems were with the current process, and to understand that better. And then after the rapid improvement event, they would then use the simulation, they would refine that simulation, and they would use that to evaluate the improvement scenarios that the group had come up with, to see if it provided any further insight into the way in which those should be implemented. So it was a project that I found really powerful, and actually got me into thinking about this a lot more, and I keep in close touch with what's going on with that particular group. And if you're interested in it, there's the website there gives you more information. There's a free downloadable booklet which explains what was done, but also really it's intended to be a practice guide for people wanting to do a similar sort of thing within the improvement teams. And there are also some free downloadable models which show those educational models that you could be using. So please, I do recommend, if you're interested in this, do visit that site. There's lots of great resources. So I'll hand back to Brittany now.
Awesome. Thanks, Claire. So one of the questions that we often come or encounter is when folks have first started using simulation, particularly in the lean context, which is when do you use it? When is it appropriate, and when is it not going to get you what you really need? And in my mind, I've developed a very simple question that I use when I'm thinking about it, and that is, am I looking backwards or am I looking forwards? So to be more specific, when I think about looking backwards, I think, okay, well, the change has already happened, or I'm looking at historical data, or I'm trying to understand what's happened in the past. And if I've made the change already and it worked, great, awesome, right? We'll have a party and we move on. If the change has already happened, but for whatever reason we didn't get the outcomes that we were looking for, that's when I consider using simulation, because it can provide some really great insight into where I may have made an error in expectation, where the process may be working differently than I thought. Maybe there were downstream effects that I wasn't expecting. And so when I've already made the change and it hasn't given me the results I wanted or that I was hoping for, that's when there's a potential for simulation. It's not always necessary, but there's definitely opportunity. On the other side, when I am looking forward, the change is proposed and it hasn't happened yet. I'm thinking about my future state, I'm engaging stakeholders, I'm going through the whole lean process. I think about the complexity, right? So if I'm looking at a very complex process, or I'm looking at a very complex political environment, often simulation can be really valuable in clearing away the cobwebs and simplifying the situation so we can all get our hands into understanding where the biggest opportunities are, get everybody on board, and really make some change. On the other hand, there are the environments where you have a proposed change, it's a very simple process, everybody's excited, and that's when lean really succeeds well, right? If you've got the culture there, you can engage everybody quickly, and you have the opportunity to pilot something in a real-life environment, great. Simulation is not necessarily required for that kind of situation. So asking these two questions, right, or this one question, am I looking back or am I looking forward, has really helped me to simplify the question of, do I use simulation or not? I'd really be interested in hearing your comments about how you make that choice. So if anybody's got some thoughts, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. There's also some additional factors you might consider, including how much variability, resource constraints, how many different scenarios you want to test. Lots of other things go into this decision, but I do think that looking back, looking forward is the key place to start. When we get into this, then the other factor, of course, is what kind of project am I trying to do? And this is just a few examples of those kind of looking back, looking forward trade-offs. So when I think about Lean, or I think about using Excel, which is typically the statistical tool or the quantitative tool I'm going to use in the Lean context, if I'm looking at managing day-to-day schedules, right, for example, or existing levels over time, looking at historical performance, drop rates, cancellations, financials is another situation where actually I might be looking forward, but is really more of an Excel-oriented question. Those are all great things to be using the Lean toolset for. Simulation really comes in and becomes very powerful when I'm looking forward towards how many of this thing do I need given the level of variability that I have. How do I optimize a shift schedule? Right? That's a very complex interaction where I have lots of moving parts. Simulation is really well suited for that. And you can see a series of other suggestions there as well that you can take a look at after the discussion today. With all of that said, I want to look at actually the Lean process and kind of how we typically move through a project and identify the key areas where, as we move into integration, as opposed to like the radiology example, which was kind of a separate mini project, how do we really integrate simulation into Lean and make Lean more effective? First and foremost, I want to point out value stream mapping, which you can actually do in the Simulate tool. And I think this is really important to point out because it really allows you to incorporate and visualize the variability in your process. We also have the opportunity to understand dependencies between proposed improvements. Right? So envision a world where you've done your value stream map. You want to propose 5 or 10 different places where you could make a project around which ones do you do, when do you do them, how do they interact. We can use simulation to set actual evidence-based targets for our charters. We can use it to validate our current state, either process map or value stream. We can use it to reduce the risk of implementation, which is where I first started using this. We can also use it just for the pure communication, buy-in context. So we're going to get into all this a little bit more detail. I'm going to start with VSM because I think it's a really good place to start. It's very simple, very easy to do. So it's one of the easiest places to kind of start your journey into integrating simulation into Lean and enhancing the ROI. Imagine a world where you have your simulation tool, you've done your value stream map up on the wall, or you've actually built it directly into Simulate, and you're able to look at that value stream during the event and validate that you actually understand your process. So in traditional value stream mapping, you input your inventory, right, your wait times, you input your process times, you input the rework, all of these different pieces. But in reality, your process steps are, in your activities, actually driving the wait time. Those are actually dependent values, right? One drives the other. And when we do a traditional value stream, we don't really understand how those two pieces interact. In a Simulate environment, you can actually put in your process times, and the wait times, the queuing levels, the amount of inventory falls out, right, as a result, which is how it actually is in real life. And you can validate that your assumptions that you put into your process steps are correct. You can also quantify the impact of those potential ideas in real time. So I say, you know what, this second step, I think this is really our bottleneck. I think we need to reduce this processing time by 20%. You can plug it in really quickly, and in 30 seconds you know whether or not that's going to be effective to get you to the outcome you're looking for. We can use that to set improvement goals, prioritize efforts, and lead us into the next few steps. This is what it actually looks like. So this is just a simple drag and drop model. This probably took 5 minutes to build. And really it looks just like the value stream that we would do on sticky notes or up on the wall, and it gives us that additional information. You can also see the resources down at the bottom, which are actually constraining our process. Once we've done that, we can prioritize, excuse me, we can prioritize our projects. So In our traditional model, we would have done our value stream, and we would have listed out 15 different ideas about what we could work on. Right? We've looked at our value stream, we've identified the bottlenecks, the inventory, the delays, all of that. With simulation, we're actually able to visualize how the variability in the process affects those key outcomes that we're looking at. The next step is to estimate the impact of those individual projects. And again, we would probably in a standard practice use Excel, use our historical performance to extrapolate what the future might look like if we ran a project. By definition, those numbers are going to be wrong because we're using historical data based on a historical process to estimate a future process. Right? With Simulate, we're actually able to do that much more realistically and estimate a project return on investment. We can look at the next step is, if we can, to examine those interdependencies, which is obviously a challenge with Post-its on a wall. With simulation, again, we're able to look at those interactions and really think about program impacts as opposed to project impacts. We can take it up a little bit and be more strategic about how we prioritize our efforts. Once we've done that, we say, okay, we started with 15 ideas, we picked the 4 that we're going to work on, now what do? Well, we need to set the right target for our project charter, right? So often, at least in my experience, we tend to say things like, we're going to eliminate all overtime, or we're going to cut costs by 30%, which is really great as an aspirational, visionary goal, but how do you know whether or not that target is really going to get you to the outcome you're looking for? Because eliminate overtime in and of itself isn't the goal, right? The goal is profitability, the goal is better throughput, the goal is patient satisfaction. We need to take it to that next level and understand how these pieces are impacted. So here's my visualization, and I apologize for the graphic. We're going to walk through this slowly. If you think about a lean project, you have a process measure, which is the thing you're actually manipulating, and you also have an outcome measure, which is the thing you're trying to impact. And if we think about our current state, right, you can look at that blue X. This is our current performance, right? Our process isn't doing what we want it to do, and as a result, we're not achieving the outcomes that we desire. So when we think about setting the target, right, 30% improvement, we may set it too low. So we may say that 30% is the right number, and it turns out that it needed to be higher. We may also set it to be 60%, right? We may actually set that target too high and waste everybody's time and effort trying to achieve a target that wasn't necessary to achieve our actual desired outcomes. The last situation is that we actually set an unrealistic target. So we set a target to be 20% improvement, and that's not really going to get us to where we want to be. So lots of ways to set the charter and determine the vision for the project without necessarily having the right information. If we bring simulation into this conversation, we're able to test that really quickly. Test 30, 35, 40, 45. What's the right number? How much do we actually need to change our process in order to achieve the goal? A couple last thoughts here. The risk reduction, this is exactly what I was talking about at the start of the discussion this morning. After you do a rapid improvement event, there's always some uncertainty. There's always something that you're not sure about. You don't know if you have the right resources. Is it really going to work? Is it robust enough to handle those unusual or unexpected situations? And what are those downstream effects that we forgot to think about? Right? There's always something that you're not going to think of, and using the simulation in that context can really help mitigate the implementation risk. This is exactly like what Claire was just talking about at the University of Warwick. Finally, I just want to touch on stakeholder engagement. We talked about this earlier when I said we want to bring everybody's ideas in, right? And quickly, with minimal time or cost, really test everybody's ideas out and see the results. I have an idea. I think we should change this process. I think we need another staff member, I think we need a new room. Whatever that idea is, let's test it out and see if it works. Okay, so once we've got all of that done, I just want to pause for a second and say these are a few of the places where I've used this. These are a few places where I would suggest you should think about starting when you're looking at your lean journey. But again, we welcome any conversation. I do want to take a few minutes now and talk about what I'm talking about, the practitioner's guide. Just a few hints from my experience about where there's opportunity to make the process of integrating simulation a little bit easier. When we think about integrating simulation, it's really easy, particularly if you're coming from an engineering perspective, to jump straight to very complex modeling, very complex simulations, lots of data, really big projects, and actually I think there's a better way of doing it. So if you think about these pie charts as the red being the amount of the project that's lean oriented, and the blue being the amount of project that's simulation oriented, I really think it's important to start at the left side, right, with some initial adoption. Let's just do a 10-minute value stream mapping exercise, feel comfortable with the simulation, get some value out of it, introduce it to the organization, and then move on with the rest of our lean tools. Right? This is really still a lean project with a little bit of simulation thrown in to add some extra value. Once we're comfortable with that, then we can start to talk about engagement. We can start to talk about making simulation a more critical part of the lean process. In particular, looking at testing scenarios, bringing everybody in, throwing a bunch of ideas up, and seeing what happens. That's a really easy place to introduce the concept of simulation, get people comfortable with it, but not overwhelm them with a new tool. And then finally, we add a little bit of purple, right, because we're combining the lean and the simulation. We're not differentiating anymore, and we're really starting to integrate simulation fully into the lean process, using it where it's appropriate, and bringing the two tool sets together. One of the challenges that, or one of the questions rather that people raise when we're talking about simulation is their experience with this historic model of really big, really complex models. I would suggest that simulation actually has a lot to learn from the lean toolset, the lean philosophy, and in particular, how to use kind of a PDCA-style approach to building simulations. This really helps us avoid some of the typical barriers that we run into when we're doing simulation projects. When we think about doing it this way, what you would envision is sitting down with a piece of paper, planning out what does my simulation actually need to do, what is the key question I'm trying to answer, what are the key variables, right? What are the things that I really need to include. I build the very simple model, lots of assumptions, lots of simple data, and I check it against my reality. Say, well, how far off am I? Right? Because I made tons of assumptions. I know I made tons of assumptions. Let me check and see how realistic it is relative to my historical performance in my current state, and then I can revise that model as I need to. The reason to think about doing it this way, as opposed to sitting down and building a perfect model the first time, is that it addresses a few of these barriers. We create stakeholder buy-in because we're generating insights as we go. Even a very simple model, as we heard earlier from Claire, is even a simple model can educate, can help us understand what's going on, can help us learn some basic concepts. We can also identify gaps in data availability early on in the process of building the simulation, so we can start any data collection that we need to do early, as opposed to getting halfway through before we realize that something's missing. It also mitigates the tendency that at least I have to make the model more complex than it needs to be. This is something that I know a lot of engineers struggle with because we want to build it perfect, and it doesn't need to be. along those lines, I think that it's really important to think about, and we need a framework for, determining how much complexity we really need to have in a particular model. What we want to start out with is really simple models that are directional, right? Something like the model that I showed you, I just need a directional answer, right? Is 6 beds enough? If yes, we're going to move on. Very simple, took me a couple hours to build as a new user, and we got the answer we needed. As we invest additional time, the model becomes more complex, and there's actually some diminishing returns. But there may be scenarios where I actually need to do it, particularly if I need to test some more extreme scenarios around my key constraints, such as optimizing a schedule, trying to figure out how many staff I need to hire, things of that sort. And then at the top end, if I really have a complex situation, I'm building a brand new hospital, I need to understand all of these complexities, then I need to really invest the time. So how do you know where you fall on that spectrum? These are a few questions to get us started and help us understand how perfect our model needs to be. The first question I find to be really useful: is this something that my stakeholders actually complain about? When you go in and you're working on a project or on a lean event, what is the reason that you're there? Right? Is it because everybody's complaining about not enough staffing? Well, great, then staffing needs to be in. If nobody's complaining about the space, then let's not worry about it because it's not actually constraining my process. As a manager, does this consume my time and attention every day? Is this something that I'm constantly firefighting? If so, we'll probably need it. Do changes in this particular variable affect how my process flows? For example, if I have equipment and my equipment goes down frequently, is that something that really affects the way patients move through my system? If so, then I need to include it. But if any of these answers are no, then perhaps I can consider leaving it out, not worrying about it until a later date or not at all, depending on how many different questions we end up needing to answer. And then finally, along these same lines of keeping it simple, how much data do I actually need in order to build a simulation? And from the traditional perspective, we tend to want to have really detailed historical data. We do lots of data collection, we do all sorts of statistical analysis, and pull together these really nice distributions. But how much of that do we really need? And can we test the simulation, make some decisions with much simpler data? Is there a reason that I can't use a simple triangular distribution? Go out, interview a few staff, ask them how long this process takes, and get close enough that I can understand how my process works, even if it's not perfect. I would argue that this is actually a really good option, particularly for beginners, because it keeps you from being distracted by all of the additional data analysis and data cleaning and validity issues that can arise with statistical work. Okay, so with all of that said, this is the conversation that we had at Loughborough on Friday, and so I want to share some of the thoughts from the workshop and tell you a little bit about some of the other perspectives on this question of how do we improve lean, how do we integrate simulation, what lessons can we learn. So the workshop was at Loughborough University on Friday, and the description is there. Really, we were bringing together practitioners from all sides, both Lean, Six Sigma, simulation, as well as both the academics and the practitioners. I want to send out a special thanks to all the participants as well as the following individuals for their thoughts that really inspired the discussion we're going to have over the next 10 minutes. Professor Zoe Radner, Professor Stuart Robinson, Mark Palmer, and then the Center for Service Management, which hosted the event. One of the big takeaways from my perspective was Mark's comments about efficiency versus effectiveness and how that plays out from the lean philosophy. When we think about lean, we have these three principles, three things that we're really trying to do: eliminate waste, which is efficiency; increase flow, which is efficiency; and then create value, which is really about effectiveness of how we invest our time and resources. And the question he asked us is there too much focus on efficiency? Do we spend too much time trying to be really fast, trying to reduce cost, as opposed to spending our time focusing on creating patient-centered care, incorporating the patient into the process, using them as an asset to the process, and can we really create more value for them as we move towards some newer forms of providing care? Obviously his suggestion was that yes, we need to focus more of our energy on effectiveness, and in particular, when we think about a lot of the ways we're measured in healthcare, we talk about utilization, right? Bed utilization, staff utilization. We want to maximize that, right? Except that his point is that you can actually provide a lower utilization for your staff, for example. You can provide better access, reduce rework, improve outcomes, and lower costs all at the same time. And that perhaps we need to stop focusing solely on utilization as a metric of success and really start to talk about value. Now there's a whole slew of issues and questions that come out of that, right? Which is, how do we measure it? How do we know if we really are creating patient-centered care? But we can solve those challenges. But I do think his point about efficiency versus effectiveness and really need to focus on things a little bit differently is really important to share. Certainly got me thinking. One of the other things that came out, and this was something that came out I think in all three presentations that were done on Friday, was how simple is too simple? I've just shown you a few slides that argue really we need to simplify as much as we can, use less data, you take less time, how complex do these things really need to be? On the other hand, we need them to be useful. We need them to be validated. We need to have some visuals so we trust them. Right? And so there's this tension between engagement, understanding, keeping it simple, and making sure that we have something that's accurate, predicts our situation, and is actually useful in making decisions. And so that tension came out quite a bit in our conversations, and I just wanted to point that out. Lastly, I want to ask this question, which is, who holds the power in a lean project? There's a lot of different stakeholders, and I've listed out a bunch of them here. All of these individuals, or groups of individuals, have power in making sure that a project is going to be successful. When we integrate simulation into that lean process, we've added another variable, right? And that's the person who actually understands the technology, holds the mouse, and clicks the buttons to build the model. And the question that was raised along these lines was, should the project facilitator and the model builder be the same person? And the answer, I think, on Friday was a resounding no, that we really need to be separating these skill sets. Or even if we don't separate the skill sets, have two separate individuals who have two different roles in a lean project, so that we make sure to balance the power, make sure that we keep everybody engaged, and that we're having open and honest conversations. The last thing here is the visuals piece, and this came up quite a bit as well. And the question is, when are visuals useful and when are they distracting? And so these are just a few thoughts about where visuals are useful, and you can also think about where they may be actually distracting from what you're trying to do. I think the usefulness falls into three categories. The first being validation. When I'm building a simulation for the first time, I want to validate it, make sure that the patients are moving through the system the way I expect, queues are building up the way I expect, things are taking approximately the time that I expect, and the visuals are really useful in actually seeing how things are moving. The next place they're really useful is in the interpretation phase, and that's really looking at the results, understanding how complex processes interact with one another, and putting those results into context. Without those visuals, it can be really daunting to look at a massive table of numbers and try to decipher what it is that it's telling you. And that really comes down to the communication. So if I have the option, right, of a table of numbers versus a nice visual, as the simulator, I want the nice visual because it allows me to interpret. As a stakeholder, someone who's non-technical, someone who's in a leadership position or a clinical position, they really want to see the visual because it demonstrates, one, that the model actually mimics reality. Two, it puts it in context of the bigger picture, and it's much easier to understand than kind of traditional forms of reporting out performance. So with all of that said, I just want to wrap it up really quickly here, and then we'll open it up for questions. A couple of key takeaways. One, I want to re-emphasize that I think lean and simulation really share a common philosophy. Sometimes they are positioned as distinct from one another and kind of with separate goals, and I really would disagree with that. There's a lot of common ground as far as bringing everybody together, engagement, visual management, and all sorts of overlap there. We also see a lot of opportunities, and increasingly I'm seeing a lot of practitioners do practice. This is like tracking all things that come out of that. We really can, by doing that, we can really enhance the lean ROI, integrate simulation into the standard process. But I think that the key message from the Loughborough discussion was that we really need to be careful about how we deploy. We're going to need strong advocacy because it's not going to happen automatically, and you're going to need a voice for change in order to fully integrate the lean and the simulation tools and have a positive return on investment. Because simulation will take time to pick up, as any new tool would. And for lean practitioners, we need to make sure that we're maximizing the return on their time, because as I'm sure you have a ton of demands on your time, and really need to be careful about what you focus on, and simulation can help you do that. So Claire's going to wrap us up here in just a moment, but I did want to point out a few other resources. She mentioned the simlean.org earlier. Definitely go check that out. That's really great. Put on by Warwick University. And then there were two webinars I would just mention, one by John Bolton back in December, who was an IHI fellow and talked to us about lean and simulation and how he's used it. Super simple models to the point where just doing them in under an hour or two, getting some value out of that discussion. Also the webinar by Todd Roberts, who's from Memorial Health System, and his discussion of planning in the OR. He was integrating lean and simulation in a little bit different way, and actually developed and evaluated the options and selected, with a small team, selected the optimal change to make using the simulation, and then actually used lean as a change management tool and as a cultural engagement tool. So kind of a different strategy than what I've been talking about today, so kind of a different perspective on it. And then finally, if you were looking for some additional resources, definitely check out the free downloadable lean models at Lean Sim Toolkit, well, at simulatehealth.com/leansimtoolkit, which is a set of models that we developed for IHI last year, and which we talked about with John Bolton. So if you put those two pieces together, you can kind of see what we're talking about in that webinar. So we want to open it up for questions. Claire, do you know what's come in?
Yes, and I just wanted to say thank you very much indeed, Brittany. That was very useful, lots and lots of food for thought there. I think this is a subject we'll probably return to more and more. The more we talk about it, the more there is to understand. And I think particularly that seminar in Loughborough really got us underneath some of these fundamental questions around power, and it's really all about how you drive forward change and how you do that most effectively, and how we as people who have tools for change can work effectively across the methodologies to make this work even better. And certainly for us at Simulate, it gave us some food for thought about what we should do with our software and how we might want to improve all of that in order to make this easier and better. So great to kind of get that ball rolling. I think there's a lot more to be said, and we're really keen to hear from people who want to join in that conversation. And in fact, we're going to be setting up a LinkedIn page on lean and simulation so people can start to develop that conversation further. So we'll send you through details of that and invite you, and if you're interested in joining in, then please do so. There's a bit of time now for you to put in your questions if you haven't already done so. There's one really interesting, challenging one here, so I'll go for it. So could you quantify how much you improve your improvement by using lean and simulation together?
Wow, that is a pretty good question. So first off, there's not a lot of literature out there actually around integrating lean and simulation. So anecdotally, there's some good stories, but one of the conversations that came up at the Loughborough conference was actually around how do we measure this and how do we get that conversation started. So I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that. Anecdotally, in my experience, it has transformed the way I think about doing lean projects. And just as one example, that first model that I showed, we did that, we implemented that process, which was great, but then leadership saw what we were doing and actually used that same model to question an investment decision that they had already made, which was to do some construction. And based on the model results, they actually decided not to build this new space, which, of course, is a politically interesting decision, but we were able to save the hospital just over $250,000 by choosing not to do that. So it's a very simple model, couple of hours of work, and we were able to have some really nice return on investment. So I'm looking forward to the research, but anecdotally, the return on investment is definitely there.
And just one other question is that obviously as people who are using these change methodologies, we get really excited about the tools and techniques and sometimes lose sight of the problem that we're there to solve. If we bring in another new technique that we're not used to using, do you think that's going to make it even more likely that we lose the outcome?
Well, I certainly hope not. It's something you definitely have to be careful about, but we're already doing the process improvement. We already have a lot of the management controls set up, right? I mean, we have reporting structures, we have program management folks who are solely focused on making sure that we keep on track. And so I think actually the infrastructure is already there to make sure that we do a good job with this. It's really just about engaging everybody in that conversation and making sure that we're not doing one-off simulation projects. If we bring it into the core of the tool set, then it gets managed just like everything else. And that's, we can avoid some of those potential pitfalls.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's all the questions we've got time for. Please do, we can answer questions afterwards. Please do email any other questions that you've got, and we'll certainly answer them. We'll send you this LinkedIn page so you can continue the debate there. Again, thank you very much, Brittany. Very interesting session, and can you just go on to the next slide, which really will circulate this. So please, if there's other questions that you would like to see included in these sorts of seminars, if in fact you've got work that you'd like to present and ideas you'd like to present, please do let us know. we have one of these webinars each month, so there's lots of opportunities to share experience, and that's really what it's all about, is just making sure that as we're deploying these sorts of techniques that we're able to talk to each other about them and share our experience, share problems and challenges, but also share the successes. And with that, I'd like to just introduce you to the subject of our next workshop, which is going to be about simulating care outside of hospital. And that's going to cover things like long-term care, people living with chronic disease, long-term conditions, who are going to be increasingly being looked after outside hospital, the impact on community teams. So we'll be looking at high-level simulations, and we'll be looking at localized operational simulations, looking at clinical teams, so all sorts of things that we can consider in that. So I really hope that you'll join us, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again there. This webinar will be recorded. It has been recorded, and the recording will be up on our website together with the slides. So if you want to tell your colleagues about it, get them to have a look, please do that, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Tuesday, July the 22nd at 11 AM Eastern Time, 4 PM UK time. And Hazel, have I forgotten anything that I should have said at this point before we finally wrap up?
No, that's absolutely everything. Just thank you from me as well for joining us today, and we hope you found an interesting conversation. And obviously we're keen to keep the conversation going thereafter, so if you do have any further questions or comments, please find us on LinkedIn. So it's the Simulating Health LinkedIn page, and we'll be posting all questions on that page, and obviously looking for your insight and feedback as well. So just to say thank you very much, and that is the end of the session. So enjoy the rest of your day.